Hi, everybody. My name is Jillian Kurdick, and here with me I have Jackie Otala. We are going to be presenting our paper about political polarization and platform migration, a study of Parler and Twitter use by United States Congress members. The authors are Jackie, myself, Isabella Grasso, Gina Matthews, Yu Lu, and Gulshan Madraki. To start off, we wanted to give a little bit of background about platform governance. Growing dissatisfaction with platform governance decisions at major social media platforms like Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook has led to a number of efforts to shift to new platforms. Both Facebook and Twitter have added limitations on content, including flagging posts, disabling posts from being shared, and removing the post altogether. These efforts now revolve around regulating misinformation about key topics such as COVID-19 and the 2020 presidential election. In response to platform governance decisions, there has been increasingly been attempts to organize mass migrations from mainstream social media and more traditional platforms to new platforms. One of the largest migrations to a new platform belongs to the political right and conservative American users who have been shifting from Fox News, Twitter, and Facebook and other platforms to a new platform. In November 2020, this movement specifically called for abandoning Twitter for Parler. Parler is a self-proclaimed free speech social media platform where substantial migration to Parler started in June 2020. Shortly after, a sharp increase in Twitter's content moderation activity and in response to a direction by Trump's campaign manager. Our study is focused on how Parler was used by US Congress members both during and after January 6th.
So to kind of set the stage, it really starts with social media platforms and their content moderation and governance. And this is not new. We know that social media platforms moderate their content and have user policies and community guidelines that the users have to follow. This first started out on Facebook with different kinds of terrorist information and very misleading illegal information. Then it sort of moved into all kinds of different misinformation, more recently with COVID-19, and then even more recently with the election, with the United States 2020 election. As you can see, they have different levels of action taken based off of the type of misinformation. But again, this is not a new problem, and it's not just for conservatives. There has been plenty of literature and articles done about different groups, specifically minority groups, that are also being targeted by content moderation on different platforms. This one was, this study was about who's affected by censorship and LGBTQIA+, people of color, plus size, and sex workers and educators all experience some sort of friction on the platform, such as content taken down, disabled profiles, and rejected advertisements. This is really all just to say that platform governance is not one size fits all. It's not a problem that's going to be solved quickly or soon. This is a long time discussion. And the implementation of content moderating algorithms, which are present on a majority of platforms, often incorporate bias, sometimes even more bias, based off of how the algorithm was written. Now, with all of that content moderation, you see people getting mad that they're getting fact checked, or that their content is being taken down because it falls under a category of misinformation or whatever. The algorithm deems that your content is no longer appropriate and it gets taken off the platform. That would obviously make you disgruntled and not like the platform anymore. So we see lots of people flocking from these mainstream platforms onto different platforms. And as Jill said, the migration of conservatives from Twitter and Facebook to Parler was not a small one, and it was not, rarely talked about. This was a large migration, at least seemingly so, and as Jill said before, was primarily due to large conservative spokespeople promoting the platform. Now, some background on Parler and what the platform is about. Their community guidelines are heavily focused on free speech, creating a social platform in the spirit of the First Amendment to the United States Constitution. And there were exactly 2 guidelines. Don't use the platform for unlawful purposes and do not spam. It was really seen as whatever you can say on the streets of New York City, you can say in this platform. Features of the platform include recommendations for who to follow. However, these recommendations definitely skewed politically conservative, and we'll have a picture, yes, on the next one, of these are the first accounts that you get recommended when you first enter the platform, and then also on your page. Features for identity protection exist, such as badges to showcase that you're a real member or that you're a news network. However, many parody accounts also exist, questioning kind of the reason for badges. The search engine is slow and very glitchy. The suggested hashtags that are kind of similarly placed to how Twitter's hashtags are placed are not dynamic and not representative of the currently popular hashtags being used. Overall, it's a young platform, most likely overloaded with users, and it resembles Twitter heavily. Jill, I think you're muted.
Thank you. Now we're going to be comparing the platforms of Parler and Twitter a little bit more. Both platforms are very similar in their functionality. Twitter reshares are called retweets, and similarly, Parler reshares are called echoes. Same with liking by Twitter and voting by Parler. The biggest difference is in the community guidelines of Parler compared to Twitter. Twitter's guidelines prohibits people from using it as a way to amplify or suppress information. They also include guidelines relating to manipulating voting and civic protests. The most notable section is the synthetic and manipulated media section in Twitter's guidelines, which is non-existent in Parler. In the end, Parler's guidelines lack depth and nuance compared to Twitter. Now we'll be looking at the January 6th in the aftermath and how that has affected Parler. On January 6th, a mob of Trump supporters made up of Trump enthusiasts, militant actives, and alternate right white nationalists stormed the Capitol building in an attempt to overturn the defeat of President Donald Trump. Due to this event, 5 people were killed and dozens were arrested for many different reasons, including unlawful entry, assaulting a police officer, unregistered ammunition, and many more. Many political figures, including the mayor of DC, refer to this as an act of domestic terrorism. Parler was accused of serving as a place where these hate groups could organize and strategize for this event. Resulting from that event, many demanded a change from Parler in regards to their moderation of illegal and violent activities that occurred on their platform. In the end, by Sunday, January 10th at 11:59 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, Amazon pulled their web services, leaving Parler shut down. This slide depicts some of the news headlines that are a result of the events on January 6th, showing the permanent suspension of Donald Trump's Twitter account and some other headlines about the shutdown of Parler.
Okay, so now we want to get down to really what the research is about. Comparing the usage of Parler and Twitter among US politicians. So the goal is to study that large-scale, well-publicized migration from Twitter to Parler and its impact on political polarization and political processes in the real world. We studied how 535 members of the 116th United States Congress, including the House of Representatives and the Senate, how they used Twitter and Parler from December 10th, 2020 to January 9th, 2021, when Parler was shut down. In December of 2020, 523 or 98% of the members of United States representatives had a Twitter account, and 104 or 19% of members had a Parler account. If we focus on the 18 politicians that were active on both Parler and Twitter, all of the ones that had Parler accounts yeah, so all of the 18 politicians that are active on both Parler and Twitter are all Republican. 15 of the 18 supported at least one of the objections to the Electoral College vote on January 6th. And the percentage of lawmakers who objected and are on Parler is significantly higher than the population of lawmakers at large. The number of posts reduced after January 6th, but it slightly increased on Parler. So now we can take a look at some graphs that showcase that. Let me move our little videos. So as you can see, this is the overall incline of US representatives getting Twitter accounts. It comes in small waves, most likely due to their re-election seasons. And then this is Parler, seemingly much smaller, but if we look at the increase in accounts generated, it's pretty huge compared to some of these waves and the overall trend of Twitter account accumulation. Here we see the increase rate of followers and following for US representatives from during our collection period, so from December 10th to January 9th. And you can see here a slight spike, one might say, in their following and follower. And this can obviously be attributed to Trump being banned off Twitter and the increased usage of Parler during and then immediately following the Capitol riot. You're muted.
Sorry. Now on this slide, to have a better understanding of the distribution of activities of our sampled politicians, the actual number of parlays and tweets of these members are represented. For instance, although Ron Estes has a larger proportion of his posts on Parler than Andy Biggs, still Ron Estes, oh wait, I feel like this is for the wrong one. No, I'm right, sorry.
You're fine.
Where was I? Oh, yeah. For instance, although Ron Estes has a larger proportion of his posts on Parler than Andy Biggs, still Ron Estes' total number of parlays is far lower than Andy Biggs' total number of parlays. We observed that the politicians with the largest number of identical posts on both platforms also had the highest percentage of Parler usage. Politicians fitting this pattern are Jim Jordan, Ron Estes, and Lee Zeldin. Now, in this graph, we graphed the number of daily parlays and tweets from our sampled politicians on both Parler and Twitter from January 6th to January 11th. Our data revealed a very meaningful silence in our sampled politicians on January 7th on both platforms. However, the activity picked up on January 8th on primarily Twitter, where 12 out of our 18 politicians shared at least one post about the Capitol riots on either Twitter or Parler. Only half of these used the Parler platform to react to the Capitol riots. After January 6th, Parler activity seems to slowly climb down until the closure of the platform on January 10th at midnight, while tweets continued on January 11th, about after the Parler shut down.
Okay, so what comes from all of this data? What's some of the larger takeaways within our research? So while this was one of the more well-known migrations, US representative activity still remained primarily on Twitter. So less than 50% of each politician's total number of posts collected during our collection period were on Parler. Now, this may seem counterintuitive. This was a huge migration. What happened? And I think it says that the migration is harder than you think. And we also have to think about the way in which US representatives use social media. If they're trying to reach their, the people that they represent and their followers, more people use Twitter. And so a migration is really only as strong as everybody who commits to it. Secondly, the parlays on Parler theoretically could have been more polarized with the laxed user policy and community guidelines, but they weren't. And as Jill said previously, often they were just copies of information already posted on Twitter. Lastly, there's obvious political polarization due to the high number of active Parler users who objected to the certification of electoral votes. That is our research. Thank you, everybody. Bye.
Awesome.